What's up, YouTube? It's your boy again, coming back to another video on this channel. Today we got a special guest today. We got former U.S. Army Intel officer. Sorry, I'm like looking at my notes as I read this. Training architect, awesomeness engineer, Trenton Miguez. How you doing? Welcome to the show.
Appreciate it, brother. Thank you so much for having
Of
me.
course. With that being said, I think I covered all of your background, plus minus a couple things. Did I miss anything?
No, it sounds pretty good.
All right, perfect. With that being said, let's hop into the first question. Since you're a retired U.S. Army intel officer, how would you explain intelligence work in a way that isn't Hollywood like moviefied or Hollywoodified to us, I guess you can say normal people who are not in the military?
Yeah, what you see in the Hollywoods intelligence or things like in the spy world seem very high action packed, a lot of guns, a lot of gadgets, a lot of good looking women and good looking cars, right?
Yes, sir.
Uh, but the reality is you're spending anywhere between 80 or 90% of your time planning, researching, writing reports,
Right.
and the sexy stuff, the having the conversations with an asset or a drone actually going and taking out a target. That's only 10% of the time of the amount of effort that you actually put into. I think where Hollywood really gets it wrong
Right.
is you never have all the information that you need in order to make the highest quality decision, but the decision still needs to be made. And so it creates a dilemma, and that dilemma is the purpose of intelligence.
You mentioned not having the highest quality of information. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, so you have different types of intelligence. So we have something called human intelligence or HUMINT. We also have things called signals intelligence or
Mhm.
SIGINT, and you have another one like IMINT or imagery intelligence. Now there's a broad spectrum of those, but those are sort of like the big three. And what you're always attempting to do, I like to related to analogy. And the purpose of intelligence is to present a insight to a very, very unique problem
Right.
within a very specific time window for a decision maker to be informed enough for the likelihood of what you're telling them is a high probability of coming into fruition, right? Coming into existence. So it gives them a predictive understanding. I like to relate it the analogy of it's like putting together a 100-piece all white puzzle. Some pieces are completely missing, so you don't even know which pieces are gone.
Okay.
You can't reference anything, so you have to try and put it together, and you only have 5 minutes to do so. And only after you connect the pieces, you can start seeing an image.
Right.
So that's sort of what like intelligence is. You don't always have the information. You're always on a really strict timeline, and you need to understand the picture well enough to inform or tell the decision maker what the picture is.
Right. That makes sense. Um, so I'm just trying to figure out how to ask this question. You said human versus signal versus another type of intelligence. I think I missed the last one. Um, how does one differ from the other, and how does one help the other?
Yeah, very good question.
Yeah.
Very insightful question that I think
Yeah.
a lot of people don't really ask. So, human intelligence is stealing secrets from people, right?
Mhm.
Obtaining secrets from humans.
Right.
Now, it's usually a face to face. It could be through a different medium like cell phones or computers or whatever. But generally, we call that human intelligence. Now, signals intelligence is all the things that pertain to your wavelengths, such as like your cell phones or radios or things like that. When you have a piece of that puzzle, such as a little bit of SIGINT,
Mhm.
what you have to try and do is extract what information you can in order to inform how you better can collect human intelligence and vice versa.
Right.
Sometimes that is complementary, and we call that cooperation, where we can independently validate from different sources in
Mm.
order to cooperate a piece of information. And that is how we develop intelligence.
Okay, that makes sense. So like my next question is like I watch a lot of TV, like the Rookie and like NCIS and like all these like military-esque intelligence TV shows, like a better verbiage. And it's like, how do you, and they always seem to have the right information at the right time. But like, it seems like from the conversation thus far is some of the intelligence that you may have may not be the right one. But so like, how would you distinguish good intelligence or good analysis versus bad intelligence or bad analysis?
Yeah, so here's a misconception that people tend to have. People think intelligence is just facts.
Right?
Intelligence is not just facts.
Okay.
What intelligence is an assessment
Mhm.
of estimative probabilities, right? Likelihoods.
Okay.
So we have facts, but in order for us to develop insights about whatever event or someone's decision making, whatever it is, we have to try and collect facts. Yes, that's true. But what we also collect on is estimative probabilities of the likelihoods of that thing occurring.
Right.
So what we have to do in order to build out proper analysis, you can't just work off of what you do know. There's something called a Johari window, and we use this in the world of analysis. Think of it as what we know and we have confirmed to know, like
Right.
the things that you know about.
Right.
The things that you don't know about, you really can't know about them. But the things that you know about and you need to look for, but you haven't really confirmed or denied the state of it, right? So we call it known knowns, unknown knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. So
Say
it comes into like this window, and they all specifically have a purpose. But for us
that.
to go,
Say that 20 times fast.
yeah, as we go and we attempt to collect on these different pieces of information,
Right.
we have to start with a fundamental assessment, and that assessment tends to have baked in assumptions. And people think assumptions are bad. Assumptions are inherently terrible. In
Right.
the world of intelligence, assumptions aren't bad if it's logical, it's critical, and you look at it through a lens of likelihoods and probabilities.
Okay.
So the assumptions is what allows you to orient your resources so you can actually collect that information. And then you can confirm or deny that assumption. And now
Okay.
you can start moving forward in the amount of analysis that you can collect.
Okay. So I'm gonna ask kind of a weird, interesting question from my POV. How much intelligence is too much intelligence, and how much is like not enough?
That's a really good question. You always never have enough intelligence to make the decisions that you need.
Yeah.
That's the game of intelligence. You wish you always had more, and if you have more than you need, you're you have to go through this evaluative process on are we that good or are we getting fed information,
Yeah.
right? So is someone attempting to sway our analysis through whatever means, through false insertion or just propagating a a plethora of information? We have to pause and step back. Think of it like if you're at the bar, right? If you
Right.
ever been to the bar, you see this cute girl, cute guy, whatever you like, right? And you go and you start picking them up.
Yeah.
You introduce yourself, and what you're doing is you're going through what we call a collection cycle, right?
Right.
You getting feedback from them. As you get more information, you start to put a picture of who this person is. Is this person really suitable, whether or not to be a one night stand, or is this person suitable to be a long term partner and they're just having a shit day? how forward someone is if they tell you all the things you want to know and they're very, very open and they give you too much information too fast.
Right.
What do you feel like's happening, right? You're like,
Yeah.
oh no, we're going way too fast with this. I need to pump the brakes because something ain't right. And that's sort of
Yeah.
how the world of intelligence is. You're looking to put effort in.
Right.
You really never have enough exactly where you want to be in order to get the date, in order to leave the bar. But you also are cautious on things being too easy. Now, granted, that's whether or not you're with a 5 or a 10, right? The
Yeah.
challenge is a lot different, right? So you have to assess who you're working against.
Yeah, as we were talking about that, like I'm literally having like flashbacks of all the women I dated and talked to. I'm like, wait a minute, this makes sense. What the hell? Like, okay, that's scary. Like, it just clicked like as you were talking. Like, damn. Um, okay, so I'll try for me to reel this back in. Um, so going back to the whole intelligence factor, I guess. If let's just say you are getting fed bogus or lack of better verbiage, bullshit information. How do you distinguish that information from, hey, this seems too be good to be true, and it probably is too good, but like this actually happened to this person. Like for example, um, let's take person A, Olympic caliber athlete, got hurt, and all that stuff. That people could say, okay, this person might be making it up, might not be, but like, how do you distinguish like that line?
Yeah, so that's where our structured analytical techniques come into practice. It
Mhm.
means essentially we have very, very strict and rigorous analytical frameworks that are still somewhat classified for the
Okay.
most part. But essentially, it's just doing in-depth analysis, and also how we talked about having our geospatial intelligence or imagery, right?
Right.
And also our SIGINT and our human, and we contrast the sourcing and we validate that information or we invalidate it. Because think of it like the news, right?
Right.
If Fox or CNN and ABC and then a European BBC is all reporting on the same topic,
Right.
but all of their articles are very, very different. But the essence of the storyline, assuming that they all have separate sources, right, and they did their own sort of journalism standards, they all have, let's say, talking about Bob. Bob is 5'10" and he likes to drink and he had a gun on his right hip. If that validates against all of those different sources, you
Right.
know that is a high likelihood of becoming true, right? That is
Okay.
a
That
high
makes
probability that is a fact.
right.
Now, you can test that, right? You can go for external sources and you can collect more, and you can look at additional reporting, or you could do any sort of analytical framework. But that's sort of how it is. But whether or not he wore a blue shirt versus a black shirt, or whether or not he
Right.
wore jeans, cargo shorts, right? Now
Okay.
we know where there's misrepresentation, and then
Mhm.
that allows us to look at those differences a little bit better.
Okay. That makes a hell of a lot of sense. Okay, that's a lot of information. Sorry. So like when you're working, like you've worked on like optimizing people, processes, and all that stuff. So like what's the most common reason or system or common reason or common system that's underperformed versus overperformed in your career thus far?
So, just to restate the question, make sure I'm understanding you. In systems, how do I determine whether or not things are overperforming or underperforming? Is that
Right.
right? Yeah. So, in the world of intelligence, we have imperatives.
Right.
It means things that must happen in order for our conditions for what we're trying to accomplish come into existence, right? An outcome, a desired outcome that we want to achieve.
Right.
That imperative informs of something we call objectives.
Mhm.
So objectives is very, very specific. It's measurable. It is not subjective. It's different from a goal, right? Goals are a pursuit of something, but a end state isn't really defined, right? It's always about a feeling, it's about a process.
Okay.
Objectives isn't about process, it's about outcome. And so what that means is it allows us to allocate our resources for that outcome, for the
Okay.
timeline, for the um, in terms of your time, your energy, your money, right? We
Right.
can plan for these things, our own capabilities, our talents, the lack of information or what information we need. We can plan against what we need to have and what we need to know in order for that outcome to essentially come into existence. And so I think the systems of whatever system you want to look at, the ones that underperform don't have imperatives, they don't have objectives, they don't have a framework to support that outcome. So if you ever think about like, I want to get fit at the new year, right? Like at the beginning of the year, everyone in December said, I'm going to get fit by the time summer comes. Well, it's summer coming and most people still got pot bellies, right?
Yeah.
So why did that happen? It's not because you lack discipline or anything else, right? What it is you did not know how to set up proper outcomes, and also you didn't know how to budget or allocate your own resources.
Right.
That's really what it came down to. You couldn't prioritize whenever something popped up at work or your partner or your kid started saying something or something happened, life happens.
True.
You didn't know how to prioritize to still meet your goals. The
Mm.
goal are very, very different, right? And that's why the goals fell apart. But if you were to set objectives under imperatives, things that must happen, you always have the ability to prioritize those resources. So when life happens, you know where you're putting your energy, your time, and your money. So it is going to happen. It might happen a little bit later, or it might happen even sooner, right? But it is guaranteed to happen because you're prioritizing it to make it so.
Okay, that's interesting. So that kind of leads me to another question where that you kind of hinted at. What's when it comes down to performance, what's more important or most important? Training, talent, feedback loop, something else?
Yeah. So hands down for me, it's feedback loops.
Okay.
So you could be the most talented person, but unless you're going to implement that talent, it's
Right.
useless. Garbage, I don't need you. You could
Okay.
be the most talented person in the world, but if you don't have the will to exert your talent, you're
Right.
useless to me, useless to the world, right?
Okay.
Training is only good up to the point where you have a determined outcome that you're trying to achieve. So, training, so what I mean by this is if someone else or you set an outcome, you can get training to achieve that outcome.
Right.
Yes, maybe you can take that training and apply to a three or four other fields, but generally speaking, you haven't really created something that's going to last, something that you can translate between completely different domains, whether it be your professional life, your personal life, or even your own endeavors, right?
Right.
Feedback loops permit you to have a cycle. And we talk a lot in the intelligence world about cycles because they're so powerful. And we have two different processes called an open loop or a closed loop.
Right.
An open loop means when that cycle begins,
Hmm.
depending on a condition, it may continue and not be in that same cycle until another condition brings it back into the cycle.
Okay.
So what I mean by this is the reason that allows us to stay in the mindset of an assessment. So every time you heard a conspiracy, right, it was because there was some sort of truth, a gap in information, and then you knew about an outcome. And your brain has to try and rationalize to close that loop. And it's just continuing to try and search for information that's going to close that loop. And that's what it means to be in an open loop. You don't let your brain close that loop. You want it to be open so you can stay in a state of assessment because you'll have a more accurate version of reality. You know that you don't have all the information. So it allows you to have more an evaluative thought process rather than a confirming of a conclusion process.
Okay.
And then you have a closed loop, right? The closed loop allows you to satisfy what your minimums of knowns need to be. So think about um, using the bar example, right? That cute
Right.
girl at the end of the bar. An open loop is not really having any sort of outcome outside of getting information on understanding whether or not that cute girl is she a one night stand or is she a somebody you're going to take home to mama, right?
Right.
that that is an outcome, and whenever you start having that conversation, you're always in a sense of an assessment. You're always in an open loop that you're always collecting more information for, right, to evaluate whether or not you going home tonight, or you might show up after 3 or 4 or 5 dates, right, and you might have a structured relationship. Now a closed loop is saying binary: is she someone whom I'm taking home tonight, or do I need to cut my losses and prioritize my resources
Right.
to the next good looking girl, right? That is a fundamental, a different approach. It's a closed loop. You're looking for a binary decision that
Uh-huh.
allows you to go back into that same cycle, right? So it connects to the next iteration of the cycle. So as soon as you start talking to her and she has that cross and that married ring, and you're like, oh, I don't even need to start a conversation, and you pivot to the next good looking girl.
Okay. I see the distinction there. That makes sense. So with that being said, like how do you identify like a possibly a high value individual in a structured environment versus regardless if it's early or later, like how do you identify that?
A high value in an individual, or what do you mean by
Or
that?
like a high potential individual, sorry.
What do you mean by potential? I want to make sure
Like
I'm understanding you well.
for example, like going back to the bar example,
Mhm.
if you don't see a ring in on a woman or anything like that, and she's cute, how do you know like if this is going down the right path or like at what stage you kind of say yes, this is a one night stand or yes, this is someone who I want to introduce to my family.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So we have something called indicators, right?
Right.
So remember that objective that I was talking about?
Yeah.
If your objective is to whatever, right? Get laid or just go for dinner, leave the bar
Right.
and whatever that thing is. You have that outcome that you're trying to achieve, and that objective, right,
Mhm.
is well defined. That means you can collect against it. So whether or not the indicators that you're seeing is something observable, it's measurable, it is instantaneous as fact. The interpretation of that fact may be construed on context or your own understanding or experience, but the indicators themselves are always true because
Okay.
they're observable, and that's what you're recording. So
Makes sense.
based upon the criteria that you set, right? So let's think about a person that you're trying to pick up. Are they flirtatious? Are they making eye contact? Did they change their vocal patterns? Is their body language open and expressive and oriented to you, or is it closed and oriented away from you? Right? Are they staying monotone, or is there intonation? All of these are observable variables
Right.
that are indicators to you to say things are going good, because everyone has a baseline,
Right.
right? Once you have that baseline, changes of that baseline, if it progresses towards your objectives and it's productive,
Mhm.
right? Then we we know that the value is being added and returned, and so we can progress that relationship. As far as what is a high value individual, because I think that was the original question, right?
Right.
How do we determine a high value individual? Well, let's take a look on how they're dressing. Let's take a look at where they're at.
Mm.
You look at a sense of context against your objectives, against the person that you're actually your avatar, right? Your imaginary ideal person, your ideal target. That's she's at 8.5 or higher. She is an extrovert, and she's probably showing a little bit more skin than necessary, right?
Right.
And she's probably either in the edge of the bar, that way she can evaluate the whole room, or she's in the center of it because she wants validation, right? So it allows you to think about these conditions
Right.
and whether or not this person possesses those conditions, and where that alignment happens, you can determine that is the value that orients towards your objectives. Because in intelligence, we don't think of things as good or bad. What
Right.
we think of, how we think about it is it productive that helps me accomplish my objective, or is it counterproductive and I'm wasting my resources engaging in this event?
Okay, that makes sense. So to kind of switch gears a little bit to more decision making in the intelligence work, how do you avoid being overconfident when information, when you don't have the full information or information is incomplete?
So we always think about, and our fundamental assumption, our baseline going into anything is
Right.
that we may be wrong, we may be misrepresenting something, our perception is incorrect. We
Right.
always do not have all the information.
Okay.
So there's a term that we use, two of them actually I want to share. One is called informational advantage. It
Mhm.
means if we possess more information, we have an advantage over potential outcomes. Okay.
Right.
So we always walk into every dinner, every conversation, looking on how we can gain information advantage. So the first thing is we ask questions that's going to yield high return of information,
Right.
but also we let other people talk more, because when other people talk more, we have more information. We don't share what we have to say. The only words that are coming out of our mouth is questions. So what they know from us versus what we gain from them is a completely different scenario. And how we think about that when we don't have enough information is something that we call perception versus perspective.
Okay.
Perception is your own worldview. It's your lens looking at the landscape of the information that you have about what you're looking at, right? That is your perception.
Right.
You have a perception, I have a perception. But the value isn't knowing that we have our own perceptions. And yes, some value, we evaluate our own perceptions, right? Our biases, our distortions, all that stuff. But real value, real advantage comes from when you gain perspective, right? I'm able to take my lens and step aside and look through yours.
Oh,
That
makes sense.
empathetic understanding gives me a significant advantage, because the difference between me and you is that you are only thinking about your own perception. But whenever I have my perception
Right.
and gain your perspective,
Hmm.
I have more information. So I'm in the informational advantage. So I know what you feel. I know what you're thinking about. I know about your stresses. So going back to that late night bar example,
Right.
you can figure out if it's on a Tuesday night or a Saturday night. Where are your likelihoods of
Right.
actually taking her home? Right? Probably on the Saturday night. Probably not on the Tuesday night.
True.
Right? So you can think about their stresses. You can think about what they're dealing with. You can think about what's going to make them feel good versus what's going to make them feel bad. What's going to piss them off versus
Right.
make them love, right? It allows you to gain that empathetic understanding so you can drive towards your objective.
Okay. So on a similar note, so I'm gonna be honest. I read Andrew Bustamante's book that recently came out. Again, not a sponsor, but Andrew, if you're listening to this, I'll happily take your money for a sponsorship deal. But I read his book, and he went to, I think, Falcon or Falcon House area. I don't know the exact. I don't remember the exact verbiage, but let's just say you're in similar to Falcon, wherever whatever Falcon is, and or in a similar situation where it's like a quote unquote hostile environment. What frameworks or mental models do you rely on most when like you're assessing risk, or like, hey, there's possible danger here, whiskey tango foxtrot, what do I do?
Yeah. So I want to paint a picture real quick
Right.
to answer your question. Have you ever, I'm sure everyone generally at some point in either school or personal endeavors has spoken publicly, right?
Right.
So as soon as you start thinking that you're going to speak publicly, you have anxiety, you have stress, you have like, what if I mess up or anything else? And then whenever you start seeing the faces,
Right.
your brain might go blank, your cortisol increases, and you're like, I have to get words out, right?
Right.
You might have thought about that. Or the first time that you went on a date, you're not sure on how things are going to go, and you can say the wrong thing and things start falling apart, right?
Right.
We call that pressing the self-destruct button. Whenever you're operating, whether it be in a foreign country or even just behind a desk, you
Right.
have this level of stress, and this sort of stress is self-destructive. And
Mhm.
so how we think about this sort of heightened state of stress is we look at it through a lens of perceived risk and real risk.
Okay.
So our perception, our brain, every human's brain, their nervous system fires significantly faster than what their conscious brain can rationalize.
Right.
So what this means is if your brain, your nervous system is perceiving a threat, your chemistry inside your brain has already changed.
Right.
You're going to look at things through a perceived lens of heightened risk. So we call those inflators.
Right.
And we also have deflators.
Mhm.
Inflators is all the things that are novel, right? So think about how many times you got on a plane and it's taking off versus how many times you got behind a vehicle or on a bike, right?
Right.
That that novelty, you're perceiving a higher state of risk versus the reality is you're much more likely to get injured in a vehicle, in a car,
Right.
than on a plane, right?
Yeah.
So that contrast is how we think about the world in terms of intelligence operations.
Okay.
Our our brain wants to look at novelty, wants to maximize that novelty, it wants to maximize other variables like that, and our brain distorts that to an unrealistic measure.
Hmm.
But through our practices, we look at what is observable. What is the information that we're actually obtaining? And does it contrast with what we're perceiving? And if that's true, you're supposed to believe, you're supposed to lean in to what the real world has, what the real facts are,
Okay.
right?
That makes sense. So that does lead me to a tangential kind of a question where you just mentioned like, lean into something that seems to be true. But what happens if it's like, I'm just trying to figure out, sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to ask this question. But like, what happens if it's like you think something is true or like the quote unquote obvious answer, but it turned out to be like completely wrong?
Yeah, so we call that adaptation, right? So we have things. So there's a difference between adaptation and improvising,
Right.
and people think that they're synonymous, and they're saying they're not.
Okay.
So adaptation is internal change to the external conditions.
Right.
Improvising is an external change. You're taking what you can possess and throwing it at the external environment
Right.
in order to create change. That is what improvising is. It's using the environment to your advantage rather than changing yourself to fit that environment more specifically. So when things break apart, we have something called a PACE plan, a
Right.
primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. And people
PACE.
think,
Sorry.
yeah, yeah. So people think that a PACE plan, if they heard it in military or law enforcement or whatever, or they tend to misunderstand how a PACE plan actually is thought about in intelligence operations
Right.
because they don't think about it in terms of intelligence operations. And so your primary plan when things go wrong just means there are probabilities, there's likelihoods on certain things going wrong, either through probability, right? Speaking on the frequency of it happening,
Right.
or for instance, the chances of you getting in a car wreck in a car is much, much higher than you sitting in your house, right? Just
Right.
logically speaking, you're like, oh, yeah, of course. But we can take that same approach as we look towards our objectives.
Right.
So whether or not you're going to get sick, you can evaluate that on you going to the gym and getting your sexy bod by the summertime, right?
Right.
So you can think that you're going to get sick, parents or friends or someone's going to die.
Right.
You can plan for those things, right? And then you can allocate your resources. You can come up how you're going to modify your resources in order to still meet your objectives. So that is an alternate plan. Whereas a contingency, you're not even oriented around that plan, that first way that you're thinking. And when things break and you can't get back onto your plan, right? So if you're traveling, for example, the difference here in a primary scenario, you're going to the gym every day, it's your normal routine, but you have a business trip coming up and you're going to be in a hotel room. So
Right.
that just means an alternate plan, right? A temporary separation from your original routine, your original process.
Right.
You're still going to figure out how you can get some lifts in. What kind of movements do you have to adapt at that hotel gym, right?
Right.
And then whenever you come back home, things are going to change. But what happens if you get fired? What happens if there's a natural disaster and you have to completely leave for an extended period of time of that area for your gym that you have, right? You have to come up with an entirely new plan, but your outcome still exists. You still have the same amount of resources, uh, largely speaking, right? So you have to adapt to those external conditions in order for you to still accomplish your objective. You're not really improvising on, okay, yeah, no, I'm just going to stay home and try and figure out how I can work out at home while a wildfire or a hurricane comes, right?
Right.
It's not going to happen. You get up and you leave, and then you figure out how to do it somewhere else. That's what a contingency plan is. So, how we think about when things change, largely speaking, we plan for it. We plan for it by probability and severity. And
Right.
when we multiply those, it tells us on where we should allocate our resources to when things are going to go wrong.
Right. But here, so kind of similar to that question, is like obviously there's white swan events where you can plan for certain things like a hurricane, like a snowstorm, and especially if you're in the Northeast, or earthquakes or natural disasters. But there, how about the black swan events? Like for example, COVID. COVID was a huge black swan event that recently happened for everybody worldwide. So like, how would you plan for something like that?
Yeah. So going back to our pace plan scenario,
Hmm.
that's actually what we call an emergency plan.
Okay.
People think an emergency just means an alternative to still accomplish your objective.
Right.
No, that's not what emergency means. It's not like a contingency. It's not like a primary or an alternate. Emergency means, hey, if we invest in anything further, it means we're wasting our resources. We still want to accomplish that objective, but currently, under current conditions, our resources and capacity, right, our capability, we will for sure, we are projecting that we cannot meet that outcome.
Right.
So, what you do is you enact your emergency plan. It means figuring out how you can get back to a place of safety so you can come up with a whole new plan. So you can come up with a whole new primary, a whole new alternate, a whole new contingency. So you can still accomplish that objective.
Okay. That makes perfect sense, actually. And to change the topic slightly again towards leadership and development, what makes someone effective at leading a team of thinkers or analysts or basically a team of people who may not be at that level of like competence, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I would say two things. The first is understanding control,
Hmm.
right? And I don't want to confuse control with authority. They're not the same thing, right? So generally speaking, when people think of leadership, they think authority,
Right.
but that's not what leadership is. Leadership is really understanding what is control and who has what control, right?
Right.
So as a leader, it is your not necessarily duty, but it is your obligation to enact control over accomplishing the outcomes that you're supposed to.
Right.
And it is also your obligation in order to what we call have a sense of secondary control that takes the capabilities and the natural talents of your subordinates, of your peers, or whoever, and leverage them to accomplish those goals
Right.
while also investing their ability to think that they have an autonomy of control of those constraints. So, what I mean by that is every person has a natural strength. We call them runners or builders.
Right.
Okay. So, either you want to create something and you want to figure out how we can try and create this process, create this system, create this framework, produce something, or are they just going to want to sit in there, optimize the process, and execute as routinely as they can? Right? Is there power in routine, or is it power in exploration and novelty?
Right.
If you understand that one difference there, you can start pairing these people up. One a builder, one a runner. That builder will sort through all of the different problems, and then they'll create a framework or some sort of system that the runner will optimize, and that's how you streamline progress.
Okay. So with that being said, how would you prevent people from like overthinking or over complicating whatever situation you want to use?
Yeah. So, like I mentioned before, that imperative that must happen.
Okay.
We have something called speaking the same language in the world of intelligence, which is
Right.
coincidentally kind of funny because everyone in the military has actually a hard time communicating with intelligence and intelligence with the rest of the military
Right.
because their fundamental language that they use is different. And so we actually have doctrine, we have books that articulate very specific words with very specific definitions so we can share and have that shared understanding.
Okay.
What you're talking about is shared understanding, being able to communicate along our own priorities,
Hmm.
on our resources that we're going to leverage to accomplish those priorities. So when we set our imperatives, when we set our objectives, being able to speak the same language so everyone understands where we're needing to push our resources, our time, our energy, our money into what objectives in the priority that is the highest objective, right? The highest priority that's going to have the most ROI for accomplishing our imperative, the thing that must happen.
Right. That makes sense. Um, you actually, funny enough, you actually answered my other question that I had too. But funny enough, so like kind of moving on to more you. I know you left the Army intelligence branch or whatever you want, however you want to say it, and now you're considered a civilian now. So how does that what lessons from the intelligence work that you did in the past in the Army translate to your everyday life, to business, to something non-military-esque?
Yeah, it's generally speaking, if I were to come up with a number
Right.
out of 100, I would give it an 80.
Okay.
About 80% of everything that I learned in the world of intelligence operations, intelligence collection, intelligence in general, in terms of the community, the
Right.
lessons that I've learned, every leader, every person in intelligence has something called an experience ledger.
Okay.
Basically, it's a journal, a very structured how we capture knowledge on the things that we've learned so we can put it into our next closed loop process, our next cycle.
Right.
And capturing that over my career, about 80% of the things that I have written down in there, I use every single day, whether it be with consulting with entrepreneurs or consulting with corporate clients or
Right.
even my personal relationships, whether it be my friends, my family, or even my partner,
Okay.
right? It is incredibly powerful. And it's one of the reasons that I transitioned from essentially creating training programs and training the next generation of intelligence officers for the Army. I transitioned to now working with Everyday Spy with Andrew Bustamante
Right.
on giving that same unclassified training to civilians to entrepreneurs, to the high school student that is not sure whether or not a 30 or a $50,000 degree is worth it, right? Or if someone who's just gotten divorced and sort of lost their way and they don't know and they're completely restarting, right? We take what we learned from the intelligence world, that spy education,
Right.
and transforming it into breaking barriers, breaking their personal barriers, their professional barriers. It's
Yeah.
incredibly valuable. And the more I get people willing to learn, right? So that's one of our conditions here at Everyday Spy in a
Right.
program called Skunk Works. If you're willing to learn and you're willing to undergo challenges and development like that, we're guarantee you a 300% ROI in your time, your energy, and your money.
Okay. That makes sense. And like, how would you design that? Meaning, like, if you had to design how people are trained to think from, let's say zero or from scratch, what would you prioritize? How would you build it? All that stuff.
Yeah, so this ties back into our very first lesson that we teach inside of Skunkworks on the what we call the recruit side or the entry level for the Skunkworks program. It's a concept called the intelligence continuum.
Right.
So if you're starting from zero and you have problems on just conceiving how thoughts are supposed to be even constructed,
Right.
a framework that we give them is people tend to use words interchangeably with data, information, knowledge, and what they believe is as a layman term of intelligence, right? And they sort of like mush these together and they use them interchangeably. When in fact, in the world of intelligence, they're very much separate. They're very different things. And how it works is think of data as a specific data point. So going back to our news example, right?
Right.
So looking at what CNN says versus what Fox says versus ABC versus New York Times,
Right.
we treat all of their data and components of their data as data points, right? So where these data points start to cluster, we we start to have an understanding of what we call a data cluster. And that data cluster just means once we apply context to it,
Right.
we can we can perceive what we call information, right? So that is information because it is a cluster of data around specific context, and that context gives us information. Now, that information is largely useless to us until we can apply it to something, right? So when we apply that information into experience, such as um, let's say a news event that happened, right? New different news events say there was a wreck on some primary route that you take to work every single day.
Right.
Well, as you hear it from different corresponding news, some are saying it's only going to be a 20-minute delay versus a 6-hour delay. But whenever another news agency says that there was a whole 18-wheeler that flipped and blocked the side of the road and there's a chemical spill, you know it's not going to be 20% because it added context, right?
Right.
So you going through that process on, let's say, giving a friend a call or looking on road cams or turning on the radio for any public announcement like the Department of Transportation official notifications, right? You applied that information that you got and you applied it to extracting truth.
Hmm.
And that extraction process is how you actually develop knowledge. That knowledge is what we capture as reusable, right? The fact that you can set up automatic notifications on contrasting all these different news sources to essentially create a curated little report for you every morning that's going to say, hey, this is the event that just happened with what Fox says, what CNN says, what ABC says, your local news source, and then what DOTD is currently saying, right?
Right.
That is knowledge that you can repeat on a closed loop system. But whenever you take that knowledge and you apply it to a very specific problem, right? You develop that insight. Whether or not you can take that primary route or even your alternate routes that parallel that route, are those closed off too because of the chemical spill? And because the chemical spill is blowing wind, you can evaluate those other routes are probably going to be closed. So you can take the one where the wind isn't blowing, right? That is intelligence. So you're not late for work. You'll still be able to go get your cup of Joe and still
Right.
be on time for work, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. More now, more for like self-reflection, I guess. Since you had a very interesting career over the course of your life, what's something that your career has taught you about human nature or human behavior that surprised you?
What was surprising to me is regardless of your age, your ethnicity, your wealth status,
Right.
or your culture, people are largely the same. We
Right.
we we still have the same sort of faculty, right? We still
Right.
have the same machine that's inside of us, and that has been generated over years and years and decades and hundreds of thousands of years, depending on what your beliefs are, right? So people are still people is what we say in the world of human intelligence. People are still people regardless if they're from China or they're from Argentina or they're from Florida.
Right.
People are still people. Conditioning changes, but their hardware is still the same, assuming that they don't have some sort of damage to the brain or
Right.
anomaly like autism or something like that, right? The
Right.
typical brain, they're still going to feel happiness. They're still going to feel sadness. They're still going to perceive whether or not if they're under a threat versus they're not under a threat.
Right.
That was the most surprising thing to me on you can still have a conversation and you can still make people feel a certain way and you can create them to do an action or you can get them to not do an action because you still understand fundamentally how they work.
Okay, that makes sense. So how's your definition of making a good decision changed or evolved from, let's say, your high school version of you to the army version to today?
It's a really good question. I haven't ever been asked that question.
Okay.
um, Let me think about it for a second. I think I evaluate my own processes, the my own ways of thinking
Right.
every single year. Generally, every quarter, I evaluate my experience ledger. How are the quality of my thoughts? Am I pursuing my objectives? How am I doing my own processes? Right.
Right.
That has changed every single year, every single quarter because I'm progressively reflecting on that. So what you pay attention to gets managed.
Right.
That's a sort of a key motto in the world of intelligence. What you pay attention to is what gets managed. What gets managed develops. And I think what everyone can take away from that is your interests change, right? Over time, your interests change. You may have a lifelong objective. You may have no objectives in your life at all. You're just kind of coasting through it,
Right.
right? And that's not me for sure. But if that's you, great. If your interests change, understanding who has an alignment of your interests serves you well. That was the most radical thing as I progress and I get older. The more I realize how true that is. So the place where you work, if what they are providing you to what you are providing them aligns with your interests, your outcomes that you're trying to achieve, you
Right.
should stay in that job. You should put more work into it, right? You should figure out how you can better those processes.
Right.
If those interests are not aligned, perhaps you should leave that job. You should leave that relationship.
Right.
You should leave that sort of coach or mentor or anything else. When you have an alignment of interests, you have this sort of invisible power that you get from someone else's connection.
Right.
That you can share resources, you can share knowledge, you can share experience, and there's a sort of magic that occurs because of that shared interest. That those interests are aligned. Whenever interests are disaligned, then it becomes compounding and now you're working against someone else for your own objectives. So
Right.
now what you do might not be perceived as productive. It might be perceived as neutral or counterproductive, and vice versa. Something that was supposed to benefit you is no longer benefiting you, is now taking up your resources with no return to what you're trying to accomplish.
Okay, that's very interesting. And so, with that being said, feel free if you want to answer this question, feel free to let me know. What belief or beliefs you held at towards the beginning of your career that you don't really agree with anymore or don't really hold anymore?
People want to accomplish the mission, right? So, in the world of intelligence, there's something called a collectivism, right? So, in any organization that you belong in, the organization does its best to try and indoctrinate you
Mhm.
into a view of what they're trying to accomplish in the world. And you're part of it. And you should be happy that you're part of it. And you should figure out how you can change what you care about and your resources and how you prioritize to make that thing come into reality. That
Right,
is largely what organizations attempt to do. It's what your college university did to you. It's what your high school did to you. It's what the your first career and the career that you're in right now is attempting to do, unless you're an entrepreneur, unless you're a self-made man, right?
right,
Now, that is a lie, right? Because that is serving someone else's interests.
right,
And if your interests aren't aligned, and that's what I mean by that is, if you're serving something else, that collectivism, it isn't actually true. Because while it may be true in a moment, it may be satisfactory as a sense of truth, right? What is truth? It's fact plus belief. But that belief is that the determination on whether or not you should be part of it. What changed over my military career is people are naturally selfish. And this is a world truism, right? So regardless of if you live in China, you live in Europe, or if you live in the United States, everyone, to the girl that's at the end of the bar, to yourself of what you're thinking about, everyone thinks about themselves first. They think about themselves.
right,
Their own selfish interests is what you need to really be aware of, because whether or not that person's subjective agenda is contradicting with the organization's objectives is going to tell you whether or not you should be investing your resources
right.
and your time, your energy, and frankly, your emotional states, right? For most of us.
All right, that makes sense. I guess the next question before we head into the lightning round is if someone wants like a John Doe or a Jane Doe wants to go into the intelligence, military intelligence. Number one, what advice would you give to this person? Let's start with the Army intelligence specifically. What advice would you give this person to say, hey, we're this is the advice I want to give you for Army intelligence. And number two, since I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, that every other branch of the military also has a intelligence branch. So what advice would you give to this person who's joining the Army intelligence, talking to the Navy intelligence, talking to the Marine intelligence, talking to the Air Force intelligence, and so on?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is, in intelligence, no matter which branch or organization that you end up going into, you have to realize the everyday life of what that looks like.
Right,
It is 16-hour days, it's 20-hour days
right,
every day. It's long hours, it's thankless work. It's you doing months of 20-hour days to satisfy a requirement for your boss, the decision maker. And when you do everything right, and things work out because of the intelligence you provided,
mhm,
they don't really thank you. They don't even acknowledge you for the most part because you did your job.
right,
When things don't go right, it's your fault. It is intelligence's fault, right? So it is a thick skin kind of job. And if that's not you, well, it's probably not your position that you need to be in.
Right.
The second thing I would say is if you have a sense of curiosity, if you have a sense of exploration, you tend to have anxiety. You're probably fit for intelligence, right? Because you're always looking to satisfy something, usually an external party, but even if it's internal, intrinsic, you're
Right.
looking to preserve yourself and preserve that outcome that you're trying to create.
Okay.
So whether or not you're an introvert or whether or not you're an extrovert, you need to understand that. And I don't mean social orientation. I don't mean social skills. What I mean is, where do you naturally have a large bank of energy? Is it interacting with people, or is it sitting behind a desk for 18 hours? Because that's going to tell you whether or not you should be in front of people in human intelligence roles,
Right.
or if looking at code or looking at reports for every day, 5 days a week, and not interacting with a person unless you're having a meeting to synchronize, if
Right.
that sounds like a good thing to you, perhaps you should think about all source, or you should think about GeoInt, or you should think about signals intelligence, right? Now, whether or not you like aircraft or you like the army guys, right? If you like sleeping in ditches and sleeping in the woods and the desert where it's hot and you don't really have anything to eat except for some old MREs,
Right.
that might be the army, right? People really don't think about, oh, what kind of conditions is my day to day going to be in?
Right.
Well, if you're operating in 120 degrees versus negative 30 degrees, you're still going to be outside in a tent, still doing the thing. You might
Right.
be in a building or not. You might have to go and talk to people or not.
Right.
Versus if you're looking in terms of if you're going to be on a submarine or on a boat, do you get motion sickness? Because that's going to suck for your whole career, right?
Yeah.
Versus thinking about aircraft and thinking about the theory of things on wind dynamics and conditions on layered things in 3 dimensions. Um, if that is a natural power to you, is thinking about things in 3 dimensions and 4 dimensions being time,
Right.
you might like and you might actually prefer the Air Force if you want a better standard of conditions. Conditions don't mean anything to you. Maybe you should think about the Army or the Marine Corps.
Right. That's true. So you mind if we do a quick lightning round?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it.
Cool. First question. Morning routine. What's the first thing you do after waking up?
Drink a glass of water.
Okay. Number two. What's the book that really changed the way you think?
Thinking fast and slow. That was a very standard first book in the intelligence reading list.
Right. Next question. If you could master one skill overnight, what would it be?
Self awareness.
What's the best advice you've ever given? Sorry, let me shut that question again. What's the best advice you've ever given to someone?
You're nothing special. You're no different than anyone else.
What was similar to that question? What's the best advice you were given?
The best advice. Oh man, whew, that one took me for a loop. It is as easy as people make it not to be.
Right. What's the most random fact that comes in handy?
Say that again. And
Most random fact you know that comes in handy.
people always tend to move right whenever entering a room first.
Interesting. If you could sit down with a cup of coffee with any leader, dead or alive, who would it be?
Well, I got to go with Jesus.
Yeah. What's the most? What's one thing most? What's one thing people often understand, often misunderstand about Intel work?
That they think it is easy.
Go-to stress reliever when pressure builds.
Very long distance runs.
That's not me, unfortunately. Uh, what's something you can't live without other than the essentials?
um, Something that I can't live without. other than the essentials. A it's like this lacrosse slash little bouncy ball.
Nice. One of your biggest pet peeves.
People speaking instead of understanding that every conversation is about communicating
Mhm.
or connecting with each other.
Right. If you could change one thing about leadership or at least leadership training, what would it be?
What would be the thing that I changed in leadership training?
Yes.
Forced self awareness, and if you don't pass self awareness, you can't be a leader.
Interesting. What's the weirdest or most unexpected skill you picked up during your career?
The most unexpected skill. These are fun questions, man. Most unexpected skill picking up in my career.
Or where?
The yeah, the art of saying information
Right.
that is being perceived as something, but in fact you're not transmitting any actual information to the other person.
Right. What's this is a similar question to what I asked earlier. One piece of advice you'd give someone entering the Intel field today as a whole.
Yeah, it's something that what we call unique ability.
Right.
Understanding your natural talents that you don't even know it's your natural superpower
Right.
because it's so unique to you
Yeah.
that if you asked your best friends or your parents or your coworkers and
Right.
you ask them what is something I'm phenomenal at and
Right.
they tell you something and it's like of course that's so easy, but in fact the average person, another person, finds that demanding, finds that resource intensive, leaning into that.
Nice. Last three questions. What's the best meal you ever had in recent memory?
Oh, best meal. Um, it would have to be this homemade pasta that I took a class in Italy just a few weeks ago on how to make pasta, how to make some spaghetti. And it was probably the best food raw made with by an Italian cook.
Nice. Last question of the lightning round. If you weren't in your current field, what would you be doing?
Probably building businesses as an entrepreneur.
Nice. So, without all that being said, thank you for being on the show. My last question, and I always ask this to all my guests. If people want to find you, where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me at Everyday Spy. Trenton at everydayspy.com is my email.
Mhm.
Or you can go ahead and into the show notes. We're going to have some links for you.
Yes.
There's a spy superpower. So if you're thinking about your natural superpower and you want to know where to start, that sort of gives a baseline. So whenever you come to everydayspy.com, we can have a conversation on how we can leverage that.
Cool. Last question, I promise. Any
Yeah.
parting words?
Any parting words? Yeah, I think everyone, regardless of if I said a whole lot of words here, if there's only one thing I want you to take away, is understand that your life,
Right.
it's you only have one, right? And that means that you shouldn't compromise on the things that you want to occur in life, your objectives. There's a way that you can get to them and accomplish those,
Right.
but you're standing in your own way. You need to understand how to get out your own way, and you
Right.
do that through your understanding your own unique ability. So take that step if you want to, if you're willing to, and if you're not willing to, goodbye. That's not a conversation I want to have with someone. But if you're willing to, I'm very eager to have a conversation with you.
Right. With that being said, for the viewers on YouTube, thank you for watching. For those of you who are listening to this audio to this podcast, thank you for listening. As always, have a good one. See you in the next episode. Peace.